Phil Egan, how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Very well. Before our lunchtime quiz today, you have the task of setting the scene for the resumption of the Premier League. You've got the tricky task of going through Newcastle, Norwich and Sheffield United today, Phil. We may as well go in alphabetical order and start with Newcastle United. We've been going through the best case and the worst case scenarios for all of these clubs. The best case scenario for Newcastle is what happens off the pitch, I presume.
Yeah, and I mean, even that, you could argue, is it the best case scenario being taken over by a Saudi billionaire? I mean, obviously Newcastle fans want to change, because one thing we've seen under Steve Bruce is it's pretty similar to what it was like under Rafa Benitez in terms of the style of play. You know, they have a few decent players, but it's not great to watch. They've had a few good results this season where they've beaten United, they drew at City, they beat Spurs, and obviously Steve Bruce is a fairly underwhelming choice as manager before the season started, because the Newcastle fans adored Rafa Benitez, but his relationship with Mike Ashley broke down. So when Steve Bruce came in, a lot of people had him up at the top of the list for who's going to be the first manager to be sacked. Then they obviously lose their first couple of games, including a defeat away to Norwich, and you think this isn't going to go so well for Steve Bruce. Then they had that win against Tottenham. So he steadied the ship. Actually, he has them in a better position at this stage of the season, 29 games in, 4 points better off than they were under Rafa Benitez. Now, they finished quite well under Benitez, but you don't really know if you're Steve Bruce, if there's the takeover, it's hard to see that he's going to be there next season. But if the takeover doesn't happen, we might find out a bit more on it, because I know one of the issues is the piracy row between Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Obviously, beIN Sports, being the broadcaster in Qatar, have complained to the Premier League. They've written to the Premier League about the dispute, and basically I think that we should get something on that next week. And that seems to be one of the major stumbling blocks at the moment. And I think Mike Ashley's getting frustrated at the moment. But I don't think Newcastle fans feel too sorry for him.
Worst case scenario then, Phil, is there a possibility that they go down?
I don't think so. No, they've got a bit of wiggle room there. They're 8 points above the relegation zone, so they should be okay. You think that even though they're only 8 points above the relegation zone, you're dependent on the teams below them to pick up enough points to overtake them, and maybe the fact that there's just enough teams between them and the relegation zone, they should be okay. But they'll probably just stumble over the line, and that's another season done, and then it's really a case of wait and see what happens in terms of the takeover.
Next club then is Norwich City, and it's kind of the opposite question for the best case scenario here, Phil. Is there any chance they can stay up?
No, unfortunately. I think their best case scenario actually probably is, aside from the Premier League, it's the FA Cup. They're in the quarterfinals of that. Obviously, they knocked out Tottenham. They play Manchester United later this month, and they'd be looking at that. They're 6 points from safety. They had that great win against Leicester in their second last game before the league was put on hold. But they were everyone's. When we picked three at the start of the season to go down, Norwich were in everyone's three, because they made no bones about the fact that they were going into the Premier League. They weren't going to spend. They were going to do what Burnley did a few years ago, where Burnley came up under Sean Dyche and didn't spend much, went down, but then actually spent money. They were able to go and buy Andre Gray at the time, who they got from Brentford, got promoted back to the Premier League, and they've been in the Premier League since. And Norwich were looking at that model. Unfortunately for Norwich, though, because of what's happened with COVID-19, their model would have been based on all the revenue they would have got from this season. And that's gone now, a lot of it, because of what's happened, and clubs are out of pocket. Now, they'll go down to the Championship. Looks like, that squad would be good enough to compete in the Championship. How many of those players will they lose? I don't think they'd actually lose that many, because maybe you're looking at Todd Cantwell, someone like that. Maybe some clubs are looking at him. In terms, from an Irish point of view, you'd imagine if they go down to the Championship, it's good, and because Adam Ida is probably going to get more game time. He's got a little bit of action in the FA Cup, and you'd imagine he'll get more game time in the Championship. Pukki has scored 11 goals this season, but despite that hat-trick that he scored against Newcastle early in the season, and obviously he scored at Anfield in the opening night of the season as well, he is that kind of player where he'd be a really good Championship striker, probably just not good enough for the Premier League.
Really? You don't think Pukki could get a move to a mid-table Premier League club and score a dozen goals a season, no?
Well, I mean, talk to Celtic fans about Pukki. You know, he didn't exactly light it up in the SPL when he was there. And, you know, look, he was brilliant in the Championship and it looked like he was going to keep that going. Yeah, look, maybe if he goes to a better club and he gets more opportunities, he could be somebody that other clubs would look at. But the thing as well is if you're a Premier League defender and you play against Pukki in one season, the second season you start to work these players out a bit.
It's true. I guess as well with a team going down this year, you have the situation about a potentially limited transfer window, given the seasons are going to be so close, and maybe any clubs worried about an exodus after going down, they might get away with one or two less sales this summer, which could be a positive for those going down. Sheffield United is the last one we want to touch on today, Phil. We'll get into the best case scenario here, which is obviously the upper echelons of Europe. How realistic is that?
Do you know what? I mentioned Norwich were probably in everyone's three. Sheffield United were in my three. I was looking at this squad thinking, where are the goals going to come from? And actually, that's turned out to be the case. But they've the second best defence in the Premier League. Only Liverpool have a better defence than them. So that's why they're doing so well. They're hard to beat. Even games they've lost, you really have to work for it. I think back to when Liverpool beat them at Anfield, City beat them at the Etihad over the Christmas period, and both those games were won by 2-goal margins, but both Liverpool and City were made to work really hard for it. And I think if Jurgen Klopp wasn't going to win the league with Liverpool, Chris Wilder is your manager of the season. It's unbelievable. When he took over, they were in League One, lost a few games at the start, gets them promoted, then gets them promoted from the Championship. And he pretty much said to them this season, look, a lot of clubs come up from the Championship and they just think about survival and maybe play with a bit of fear. But he said, we can't do that. We have to embrace it, show no fear. And what he's got a group of players that, and look, I'm sure this is the case for a lot of footballers, that there's rejection. But some of these guys were down in the third tier of English football, including someone like Enda Stevens. And, you know, when you've got players like that get to the Premier League, they don't want to give that up. And look, it'll be hard to replicate that next season because, you know, he's stuck with the same group of players, but we got a little brief insight maybe with the spending in January when they brought in Sander Berg that they are probably going to add to their squad. So what will that do? But they still lack goals. You're looking at their top scorers around 5 goals, Mousse and John Fleck. David McGoldrick was a revelation for them in the Championship last season. Hasn't scored in the Premier League this season. But I think they'll still come up short in terms of Champions League, even though if they were to win against Aston Villa next week when the season kicks off again, they're up to 5th. They're ahead of United, which is unbelievable. And 5th could be good enough for Champions League, depending on what happens with Manchester City's case in the Court of Arbitration for Sport. But I still think with the 9 games to go they've got 10 games to go. But I think eventually the lack of goals would probably catch up with them. But they could still get a Europa League spot, which would be unbelievable. But then how do they juggle the Europa League and the Premier League next season? So it's, but as I said, if it wasn't for Jurgen Klopp, Chris Wilder is your manager of the season.
Yeah, for sure, it seems that way. So best case scenario for Sheffield United, Champions League. Worst case scenario, still a pretty good season, and just hope to hold on to everyone come the summer. Well, it is the summer right now. Come the transfer window, I should say. Phil Egan, a pleasure. Enjoy the weekend. Thanks a million.